Welcome back, seniors. Today is day 9 for Unit 4. We're taking a look at the types, causes, and effects of inflation. I have put both keys for the Do Now and the homework on Schoology. You can access those and check your work. Big question, why does inflation happen? We're going to describe two types of and causes of inflation, then the effects of inflation on people. Ties in with our last standard key terms quiz on May 4th, and our unit assessment will be on May 16th. These are the last key terms that we're going to look at today. The ones in bold. Creeping, hyper are two types of inflation, and then our two causes are demand pull and cost push inflation. Keep the big picture in mind. We're looking at economic indicators, these statistics about the health of the economy. Economists are like doctors, performing these tests, looking at this data, and then they will make recommendations on what we need to change. And you can study about those changes in college in your macroeconomics class. And those changes will come from policymakers, also come from the Federal Reserve, in which they will be adjusting taxes or increasing spending or decreasing those or doing something with interest rates. A variety of ways in which the economists can try to manipulate these numbers and try to maintain a healthy, stable economy. So for today, we'll finish up here by looking at inflation. Taking a look at inflation rates in the United States over the past 50 years, we should first off think, what do you think is a healthy range for inflation? You can see that we've been all the way down to near 0%, all the way up to 13%. And obviously, economists don't like to have a lot of instability. We like stability, and so we want to find a place that is pretty consistent. And generally, that's about 1 to 3% is our target healthy range for inflation. So 1 to 3%. And I like to think of inflation by taking a look at my cat. Not my cat, obviously, but this cat demonstrates the two types of inflation real nicely. And you can see that at the start of the video, this cat is just slowly moving along, creeping along. That's the type of inflation we like, as opposed to this type of inflation, which is hyperinflation. And so we can see these two types by taking a look at some graphs as well. Creeping inflation is our goal, slow, steady rates of 1 to 3%. You can see over the past 10 years, the United States has generally been close to that 1 to 3%. Sometimes a little bit above, sometimes a little bit below, but generally pretty consistent. What we don't like is hyperinflation. It's the hyperinflation that's out of control, leads to economic collapse, instability. And you can see this example from Zimbabwe a few years back, in which inflation rates, this top line, drastically increased, and they thought that let's print more money. Printing more money does not stop inflation, it only makes the problem worse. That's the money supply that is shown here in the green line. As the money supply increased, also the inflation increased. So we don't want hyperinflation, we want to stick to creeping inflation, 1 to 3%. And so when we achieve that when we achieve creeping inflation of 1 to 3%, we're going to have economic stability. Recall those 6 economic goals. Here's how we achieve economic stability. So look at two causes of inflation. This is the second part of this learning objective. We have to consider which side of the economy are we on. And we have looked at these two sides already. We've looked at the supply side and the demand side. And the demand side, of course, is with consumers, and the supply side is with producers. And our two types of inflation fall on either side of the economy. Demand pull inflation will be specifically as a result of consumers on the demand side, and cost push inflation is caused by producers. And so actually, you guys already know this. We've already looked at this before. Now we have a fancy vocabulary words to put with what we already know is happening. So let's first take a look at demand pull inflation. It's an increase in the money supply, basically when we have too many dollars chasing too few goods. And so consumers spend money faster than businesses produce, and when we have a greater quantity demanded than what is supplied, we're going to have a shortage. And as we've already studied, when you have a shortage, you get rid of a shortage by raising prices. And anytime that we are raising prices, that is inflation. And so anytime that we have had a shift in the demand curve and prices have risen, that is inflation. And so here's another look at it. We have our aggregate demand curve, which is same as our market demand. And we have our supply curve, aggregate supply curve. And we have equilibrium point here, just like what we have done before. And then we have any number of reasons that cause a demand increase. Typically, a change in consumer income. People get a pay raise. Maybe we have more people who are working, so our unemployment rate has gone down, and now we're going to have a demand shift to the right. And when we do that, we're going to see our equilibrium point go from P1 all the way on up to P2. So it's a rise in price and too much money chasing too few goods. Demand pull inflation. The other side, cost push inflation, we've looked at as well, and this one ties into the changing cost of inputs. And so when it's more expensive to make something, businesses are going to slow down their production, and if they have, and they will push prices up due to those increased costs. And we've looked at that on a graph before as well. We have our demand curve and our supply curve, and anytime we have an increase in our cost of inputs, we're going to have a demand shift to the left. And so our equilibrium point will start here, and that will end here, and that results in a price increase. That price increase is inflation, and we call that cost push inflation. The costs of these inputs is pushing the prices of these goods and services up. So look at a couple of effects of inflation on people. This is a good example showing what we call the wage price spiral. Let's say that we have a fertilizer company. Let's say that those workers win pay increase. That's going to make it more expensive for the fertilizer company to produce fertilizer, and so they're going to increase the cost of their products. Well, farmers then buy that fertilizer, which now costs more, so it's going to cost them more to make and grow their agricultural products. And so when the farmers sell their agricultural products, they're going to sell it at a higher price to help pay for the increased cost of the fertilizer, which is an input into the production of agriculture. So the stores buy those agricultural products, which are more expensive, and they're going to then sell them for a more expensive price to consumers. And so then the employees go to the store and they find that the prices of things are increasing, and they go back to their employer and they demand a pay increase. And so you can see it's the cycle that continues on and on and on and on. You can think about the current debate over $15 minimum wage and how that is another example of how the wage price spiral can happen. And this is an argument against raising it to $15 an hour. Another effect of inflation on people is when it comes to purchasing power. Purchasing power is simply the ability to purchase goods and services. And as prices rise, our purchasing power declines. So think about $20 in your pocket. Today, it's not going to buy as much as it could a year before or 20 years ago. And you can illustrate that with this graphic. That $20 could buy a basket full of goods 20 years ago. But a few years later, it's going to buy about half of those goods. And a few years after that, it's going to buy even fewer of those goods because the prices of these things are increasing, but the value of this $20 is not increasing, it's actually decreasing. And so an argument in favor of a minimum wage increase, we can look at the real value of minimum wage going back to the 1960s and compare it to today. And we can see that minimum wage today is about $7.25. Back in 1960, it was just about $7 as well. So we haven't seen any change in the real value of minimum wage. And so people that argue for a minimum wage increase will cite this data and say that minimum wage is not keeping up with the cost of inflation. It also has an effect on personal income, people on fixed income, so these minimum wage earners, people with pensions, retirement plans, they're vulnerable to inflation because they're receiving a fixed amount of money every month, and as the cost of goods and services increases, the amount that they can purchase decreases. So you want to find a job that has a cost of living adjustment that is going to give you a pay raise every single year that is going to at least meet the cost of inflation. It makes it difficult to plan for the future. It makes it difficult to plan for car, home, tuition, and it can lead to economic inefficiency and instability. And so lastly, one example of this is you start college with a savings of $10,000. And if you plan to spend $2,500 a year, you're going to use up that $10,000 after 4 years. But because of inflation, each of those dollars buys less every single year. So to pay for exactly the same thing you bought your freshman year for $2,500, by the time you're a senior, you now need $2,750. So therefore, this $10,000 decreased in value over those 4 years because of the rising cost of goods and services. So as you're planning for the future, you need to consider the cost of inflation as well. So again, to quickly summarize, these are some of the effects of inflation. Your homework is a quiz on Schoology, key terms quiz coming up. Let me know if you have any questions. Good luck.